Thanks and good evening, everyone. It's great to have you here tonight. I'm John Holler, the CEO of the museum, and I'm so happy to welcome you tonight on behalf of our board, our staff, our members, and our many volunteers. We want to thank the Intel Corporation for its annual support of this program now for 5 years running. We're happy to have Intel as a partner, and their generosity is making all of this possible, so thank you to them. The position of Chief Science Advisor to the President dates from Franklin Roosevelt's administration. The first person to hold that title was Vannevar Bush. George Kistiakowsky of the Manhattan Project and Harvard also held this post, as did MIT President Jerome Wiesner, just a few of the distinguished people to have that title. Now, today's modern Office of Science and Technology Policy was formalized and created, as with so many forward-looking science and technology policies, by President John F. Kennedy. And since that time, the scientists to head the office and to act as the President's Chief Science Advisor while running that office have been equally distinguished. Our guest tonight is the man who runs that office and holds that title today, Dr. John P. Holdren. Before his appointment by President Obama, John was a professor in both the Kennedy School of Government and the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard. He also served as director of the Woods Hole Research Center. Now, we're especially happy to have John tonight because he is really a Northern California guy. For more than 20 years, beginning in 1973, he was on the faculty of the University of California, Berkeley, where he co-founded and co-led the interdisciplinary graduate degree program in energy and resources. His PhD is from Stanford in aeronautical engineering and theoretical plasma physics. He's the winner of numerous academic prizes and a very sought-after speaker internationally on a very wide variety of subjects in science. He is capable of and prepared to cover a lot of ground tonight: the major science initiatives from the White House, the Sunshot Grand Challenge, the technology of guarding against meteor strikes, the BRAIN Initiative, many others. And if you know of some that you'd like to ask him questions about, please do pass those cards to the front. Covering that ground with him tonight, of course, is John Markoff, who is a great friend of the museum. He's a workhorse of a moderator. He was here just a couple of nights ago doing the same thing, and he's now returning. John, of course, is a senior writer for the New York Times for a long time in technology and now in science, and he's the perfect man for the job this evening. Please join me in welcoming John P. Holdren and John Markoff.
Do you think of yourself as a Californian?
Originally, certainly. I'm pretty much bi-coastal now, but yeah, I was raised in San Mateo.
How early did you come to Northern California?
At the age of 4. I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My parents moved to San Mateo when I was 4. I grew up in San Mateo, went to public schools in San Mateo, then went east to school to MIT, but I came back to Stanford for my PhD and my wife and I lived in California for 30 years as adults before moving east.
I read that you're passionate about fishing in the East, and so I thought, well, that's not backpacking in the Sierras.
Well, I was passionate about backpacking in the Sierras for the 30 years that I lived here as an adult, and even when I was a teenager, I backpacked.
So it's the way I wanted to start tonight. I too am passionate about backpacking in the Sierras, and there is actually a glacier in Northern California, not in the Sierras, but in the Trinity Alps. It's literally gone away in the 30 years that I've been hiking there. It's just not there. And so I wanted to begin with climate. And I wanted to actually begin with something that you said to the New York Times in 2007. To quote, you said, "I am one of those who believes that any reasonably comprehensive and up-to-date look at the evidence makes clear that civilization has already generated dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system." And then you add, "What keeps me going is my belief that there is still a chance of avoiding catastrophe." So here we are 6 years later. How are we doing?
Well, first of all, I would reiterate that optimism and say there is still a chance of avoiding catastrophe. We are not doing as much as we should be, not doing as much as we could be, but we are doing a whole lot more than we were 6 years ago when I wrote those words. The Climate Action Plan that the President rolled out on June 25th in his speech at Georgetown University has a lot of the elements that we need in a national climate plan and in an international strategy. We actually, notwithstanding the inability to get a comprehensive climate law passed in the first 2 years of the first term, did get a lot done that was relevant, including the most forward-leaning fuel economy standards in the history of the country. Some of the most forward-leaning fuel economy standards in the world now being extended to heavy vehicles as well, making a big difference. Big boosts in investments in low carbon and no carbon energy technologies. A variety of programs and policies that have led actually to a decline in greenhouse gas emissions in the United States.
So you think that there's evidence that there is a link, that we've changed these things and you can see it in the
absolutely you can see it. Scientists can see it, but everyday folks in their experiences of the world around them and what they see on the television can see that things have changed. And the only question for folks observing that things have changed is whether humans are doing it or whether it's just part of a natural cycle of some kind. But the evidence is in fact overwhelming that humans are largely responsible for what we're experiencing. And the evidence is also overwhelming that it's already harmful. You know, in occasional pieces you see arguments about whether harmful interference in the climate system has already occurred, but in fact we're experiencing increases in heat waves, increases in droughts, in floods, in wildfires, very clearly linked by fingerprints of a variety of kinds to global climate change. We know, of course, that sea level is inexorably rising, that is causing increases in coastal property damage, increased damage in storms when storm surge is added onto the increased sea level. And of course, as you note, glaciers are going away over most of the planet.
I think I saw you quoted as saying that you felt global warming was a poor choice of words in a sense. That
I do think it's a poor choice of words. Global warming implies something, first of all, that's uniform around the globe, that is all about temperature, that is gradual, and that might even be good for you. There's sort of a sense of warming, how could that be all bad?
Yeah.
And the fact is it's highly non-uniform regionally and globally for a whole variety of reasons. It's, for example, 2 or 3 times as fast as the global average at high latitude. So you're seeing in Alaska and around the high latitudes much faster change, and it's well understood why. It's not all about temperature. It's about all of the variables and patterns that make up climate. That means hot and cold, wet and dry, windy, stormy, when the snow melts, how fast it runs off. All of that is climate. And in fact, temperature is just a proxy, if you will, for the overall state of the climate system, in much the same way as your body temperature is a proxy for the state of your body system. You know, people say, well, what's a couple degrees centigrade, say 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit among friends? Well, if your body temperature goes up 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, you know it's telling you something about the state of the system. It's not the temperature per se, it's the indicator that something is badly wrong. And similarly, if the global surface temperature goes up by 2 degrees Fahrenheit, it's not just the 2 degrees Fahrenheit on the average that we're experiencing, it's all the changes in circulation patterns and precipitation patterns and storm traps that go with that should worry us.
Was there a recent report that suggested while the rate might be dramatic, that there's less concern about really dramatically disruptive things?
I don't think there's less concern about dramatically disruptive things. I think there's more. The latest report from the National Academy of Sciences, just out a few weeks ago, to me is a quite pessimistic report, noting that disruptive climate change, which is the title of their report, disruptive climate change can result not just from very rapid changes in the climate variables themselves, but can result from situations where gradual changes in the climate variables push ecological processes over a threshold. And so
that's what I was asking. Yeah.
You can have abrupt change resulting even from gradual changes, like changes in sea level, where a gradual change in sea level may lead to, after a relatively short time, saltwater intrusion in freshwater aquifers in coastal regions. Again, it can lead to major increases in storm damage. You have the situation with the coral reefs, where the coral reefs are the second largest reservoir of biodiversity on the planet after the tropical forests. And the coral reefs now appear quite unlikely to survive a global average surface temperature increase of more than about 1.5 degrees centigrade. And again, it doesn't matter.
At current rates, when will we cross that? How soon is that?
Probably 2035 or 2040. And of course, the coral reefs are subject to multiple stresses. They're experiencing ocean acidification, which is also associated with the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, some of which ends up being dissolved in the ocean and producing carbonic acid. They're being subjected to overfishing. They're being subjected to physical damage by cruise ships that anchor and pull out a big chunk of coral reef every time they pull the anchor up. You may not think that's a big problem until you look at the number of cruise ships in the world and how often they anchor on coral reefs. But they're under assault from all of these things. And it appears that just from the standpoint of the combination of acidification and temperature, that the coral reefs will probably be close to finished by halfway through this century. That's very gloomy news indeed, not just because they're the source of a large part of the biodiversity on the planet, but because the other major source, the tropical forests, are also differentially vulnerable to climate change. We're in danger of drying out the Amazon.
So the most recent Mauna Loa number that I could find is 393.66, and I was wondering if you could explain that. Could you put a context around that number?
Well, the pre-industrial concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was around 280 parts per million, and now we're nearly at 400 parts per million. So in round numbers, we've gone up by some 40% in the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. But in addition, we've added more methane, chlorofluorocarbons, black carbon particulates that tend to warm the planet. We've masked part of it because we've also added reflecting particulates to the atmosphere and cloud forming particulates to the atmosphere. And some of those clouds are bright white and they reflect sunlight. But that's one of the interesting dilemmas of the modern age, and that is if, for good reasons of public health, we reduce particulate pollution of the atmosphere, we will actually unmask more of the warming from reducing the reflective and cloud-forming particles, although reducing the black soot will reduce warming somewhat because those black particles do heat the Earth.
So going away from coal has a consequence of accelerating?
Not accelerating overall. Going away from coal, from the reduction in the carbon dioxide emissions, will bring bigger benefits than the augmentation of warming by unmasking from the reduction in particulates.
But is there, in looking at that number, that single number, can you see a particular number that's a point of no return?
No, there is no red line that's a point of no return. You know, people have said, and in fact the G20 have agreed that we should try to avoid exceeding a global average surface temperature of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial, and that is associated with an atmospheric concentration around 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent. That is counting not just the CO2, but the net effects of other warming and cooling things we add to the atmosphere. If it all adds up to 450 parts per million, you have about a 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees C above the pre-industrial level. And some people have concluded that because the G20 agreed on that as a target, that must be the red line, and below that is safe, and above that is dangerous. And that's nonsense, because we already are experiencing, as I've already argued, dangerous climatic effects at a CO2 concentration of under 400 parts per million, and a CO2 equivalent concentration that's not much different, because very roughly speaking, the reflective particles are currently canceling out the effects of most of the non-CO2 warming factors. And so the actual CO2 concentration, which is approaching 400 parts per million, is very close to the CO2 equivalent number. And again, with that number around 400, we're already hurting. Yeah. In addition, and this is something that relatively few people outside the climate science community understand, because of lags in the Earth's climate system, we are not yet experiencing the full climate consequences of the greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. In other words, if we could stop instantaneously and hold the atmospheric concentrations where they are right now at say 400 parts per million CO2 equivalent, the temperature would continue to coast up from the current roughly 0.9 degrees C above pre-industrial to something like 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial. So it may not be possible now to stop in time to save the coral reefs, but it is certainly possible to stop in time to avoid a lot of other consequences that we would be very unhappy about.
And so I wanted to ask you about strategies that we might pursue to make big changes here in the United States. Natural gas, there's been this dramatic change over a relatively short period of time. Is it right to think of natural gas as a bridge fuel?
It is right to think of it as a bridge fuel. It's not a long-term solution because over the very long run, even natural gas causes too much CO2 to be added to the atmosphere. But in round numbers, natural gas emits about half as much carbon dioxide to the atmosphere as coal burning does per kilowatt hour of electricity generated by those two sources. And so substituting out coal with natural gas brings you a big benefit. It's just not big enough for where we need to go. You know, the president announced a goal of 17% below 2005 emissions for this country by 2020. Natural gas can help a lot getting to that goal. But the next goal that the president, I think, correctly announced was to get more than 80% below 2005 emissions by 2050. And you can't do that with natural gas.
Yes.
Natural gas emits too much CO2 to achieve a goal that constrained.
And given, even given the tremendous controversy about solar, the price has been falling dramatically, hasn't it? And can it step in and do something in a major way?
It has. Not only has the price of solar energy continued to fall, but we have actually quintupled the amount of solar electricity generation in this country since 2008. We have more than doubled the amount of wind electricity generation in this country since 2008, and wind is actually much bigger than solar at this point. Solar started from a smaller base, and so even though it quintupled, it's still not nearly as big as wind, which has doubled and some over this period. They're both getting less expensive. Our aim in the Sunshot Global Challenge is to make solar energy, solar electricity cheaper than coal. And I think that's entirely plausible by 2020.
You have this problem that there aren't really great ways to store solar energy yet. I mean, how much of an obstacle is that? Do you need to keep those traditional power plants around to compensate for the fact that it only works?
Well, actually, there are a number of good ways to store solar energy. One of them was developed by green plants. And that's one of the reasons that biofuels are so interesting. They're stored solar energy.
And it's scalable, you think?
And biofuels are certainly scalable, particularly advanced biofuels that don't compete with crops for land and water. We're going to need a real array of low carbon and no carbon energy sources going forward. We need to see if we can overcome the challenges that have impeded the growth of nuclear energy. We need to continue to work to make solar and wind less expensive. We need to develop the advanced biofuels that won't compete with crops. And we need to figure out how to capture and store the CO2 from the fossil fuels we continue to use. The world and the United States are still more than 80% dependent on fossil fuel for all of their energy. For all that you hear about renewables and nuclear and so on, we are an 80% fossil fuel dependent world. And that's not going to change overnight. The global energy system represents a capital investment somewhere north of $20 trillion. It turns over on a time scale of 30 to 40 years. That's the average lifetime of energy facilities. And if you've got a $20 trillion investment that turns over in 30 or 40 years, you're not going to replace it with something else overnight. So one of the things we need to do, recognizing that we're going to continue to burn fossil fuels for decades, is to reduce the greenhouse impact of that by capturing and storing the carbon dioxide.
In Poland, I think the OECD issued a report that said that fully 8% of our economy was attributable to fossil fuel subsidies, which was a very disheartening fact to me if it was true.
It doesn't sound right to me. We spend something in the range of 8% of GDP on energy altogether. In some countries it's 10%, in some countries it's 7%, but that's the ballpark. And of course the whole cost is not subsidies. So I find it a little unlikely
large number.
that 8% of the economy could be fossil fuel subsidies.
I hope they're wrong. So what's your thinking about geoengineering approaches to the problem? Woolwood has proposed putting particulate matter in the stratosphere. Is that a dumb idea?
Probably. I do think we need to look at geoengineering approaches, if only to understand what their leverage is, what their limitations are, what their side effects are likely to be, because you can certainly imagine climate change proceeding in a way that would cause sufficient alarm that societies would grasp at any straw that seemed to be available. But the danger of putting large quantities of particulate matter in the atmosphere to try to counteract the warming effects is not just the cost, but the side effects of putting the particulate matter up there. Are you going to wreck the ozone layer? Are you going to change precipitation patterns in drastic ways? I mean, the question there is whether the cure is worse than the disease. There are approaches that, strictly speaking, qualify as geoengineering that look quite sensible. One is the white roofs idea. That is, if we make the roofs of buildings white instead of gray, brown, or black, they will reflect sunlight. If we made pavement white rather than black as asphalt.
But if you put solar on it.
But that is a relatively small percentage of Earth's surface. That is, the fraction of Earth's surface, land surface that's urbanized is 2 or 3%. And if you imagine turning it all white, it would go in the right direction, but it wouldn't be big enough to offset the effects of the doubling of atmospheric CO2 that we're headed for.
Yeah. So let me ask a hypothetical question. If you were a scientific advisor to a $1 billion venture capital fund instead of your current role as the president's scientific advisor, with a 100-year time horizon and a goal of averting a dangerous level of global warming, and you had to pick one of the following as your top priority. Let me give you a list, and you're welcome to reject the idea, but would you invest in carbon capture, energy efficiency, including smart grids, nanotechnology, natural gas, next generation nuclear, centralized renewables, distributed renewables, or solar radiation management? Could you pick one?
No, I couldn't pick one. I would do all but the last.
Okay.
And solar radiation management, which is another term for geoengineering, is again something on which I would recommend doing studies to understand what we'd be getting into if we tried it. Again, one of the dangers there is grasping in desperation at solutions that are not solutions. If there are solutions there, we need to find them. And if there are only non-solutions there, we need to know it.
Yeah.
But I would invest in everything else on your list.
You
need a portfolio.
Yeah. Well, Silicon Valley has gone hot and cold on green investments over the last decade.
I think they'll go hot again, by the way.
Okay, that's good. What was your personal route into climate issues?
I became interested very early on in my career as a technologist in the proposition that technological silver bullets, technological panaceas, were being oversold. I was struck by a saying of one of the great physicists of the 20th century, Arnold Sommerfeld, who in 1946 said, by 1960, nuclear energy will have abolished poverty from the face of the earth. That's an exact quote. And of course, the fact that that couldn't possibly come true says as much about poverty as it does about nuclear energy. The notion is that very often technologists who are enamored with the positive aspects of what they have developed or are developing overlook the limitations. And so as a technologist myself, I thought it was my responsibility to try to understand not just what the opportunities and possibilities and potentials were, but what the limits might be. And early on in pursuing that idea, it became apparent that environmental limitations were among the most serious ones in the energy space. My own work when I was working on my PhD was on theoretical plasma physics, and the application that I was most interested in was fusion energy. And the story about fusion energy was that it will be infinitely abundant, dirt cheap, completely safe, no proliferation hazards whatsoever, and it will be the holy grail. And while I thought and still think fusion energy would be very much worth having, it turns out that it too has liabilities, constraints, and limitations. And my thought was, if we understand clearly what those are, we can work to minimize them during the design process rather than look for patchwork solutions afterwards. And about the time I was thinking these thoughts, a number of other much more senior and experienced people were coming up with studies which were reinforcing those views. For example, in 1970, there was a summer study done at MIT with researchers from all over the world called the Study of Critical Environmental Problems, asking, are there environmental problems that are serious enough to be considered really critical in terms of their impacts on human well-being? And they came up with a list of about 22, of which 15 were associated with energy supply. And it was already apparent at that time that climate change was likely to be the most problematic of all of the environmental impacts of energy, not least because carbon dioxide is not just a sort of a side effect, it's one of the principal combustion products of burning fossil fuels.
Did you come from a family of scientists, a family of engineers? What was your...
No, my mother was a secretary and my father was a salesman, and neither one finished college.
So what pulled you toward science?
Well, both my parents were very bright. The reason they didn't finish college was World War II. Both of them had 2 years of college, but they were interrupted by World War II. And my mother in particular was a voracious reader, and every week she would bring home a gigantic stack of books from the library about every possible thing. And she would read the books and I would read the books, and then she'd go back to the library and get another big stack and bring them home. And so I became interested very early on in science and technology, among other things.
And science fiction?
Science fiction, not so much. I only started to read science fiction later. I did read a lot about rocketry and about aeronautics and about space. And that's a major reason that I became an aeronautics and astronautics major at MIT.
I was wondering about what kind of influence Sputnik might have had on you. You were 13, I think, when Sputnik was...
A big one, yeah. I was just going into high school, my freshman year in high school. And like everybody else, I could see this little glimmer, this little dot moving across the sky, and understood what it was. Certainly it had a big impact. I mean, I had been reading about space and rocketry and so on for years at that point, and I had been making solid fuel rockets out of my mother's used lipstick tubes in the backyard with chemistry set ingredients. But the actual experience of seeing Sputnik up there was very dramatic.
So your own career as an amateur rocketeer, how successful were you with your mom's lipstick tubes?
A couple 100 feet.
That's not bad. And you avoided injuring yourself?
I did. I did have a few explosions which discolored the ceiling of my bedroom, but...
You were lucky. And so then, how did your first job was at Lockheed after high school? What led you to...
I had a Lockheed scholarship to MIT, and to my delight, the Lockheed scholarship included summer jobs at Lockheed. Okay. And the first one was right after my senior year in high school. Even before I'd started at MIT, I had a job at Lockheed in Palo Alto. And then in subsequent summers, I worked at Lockheed in Sunnyvale and got very wide experience of the aerospace industry in these various summer jobs.
Did you have to have a clearance then, even in...
Well, in fact, the first summer, right after my senior year in high school, the clearance I had was a company confidential. And I was working on putting parts together for the orbital programmer of the Midas spy satellite. The second summer, I was given a job. I now had a whole year of MIT Aero and Astro under my belt, and I was given a job in a group called Reentry Aerodynamics. And I didn't have a clearance at the beginning of the summer, but the first report I wrote they classified secret, and they took all my notes away, as well as the report. And the third time that happened, they gave up and went through the rigmarole of getting me a clearance. So I had my first secret clearance at 19.
And was that, were you doing computational fluid dynamics? Were you doing aerodynamics? Did it involve computing?
I was doing aerodynamics on various shapes that related to reentry vehicle shapes.
Yeah, interesting. And this was long before your career in arms control, I take it.
It was.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, we could talk for the entire hour about climate, but I wanted to ask you if you could point to some of the other important initiatives in OSTP now. I mean, if you had to sort of point to other high priorities.
Yeah, and I would name a number of them. And when you say initiatives in OSTP, I mean, these are really initiatives of the administration, initiatives of the president, in which OSTP has played a role. But a very big set of initiatives has been around the role of science, technology, and innovation in driving economic growth, in creating new businesses, new industries, new jobs, high-quality jobs particularly. And the president announced already in September 2009 a major initiative in innovation in which we basically asked, what are the underpinnings of an innovative economy? And we concluded, and the president rolled this out in September of 2009, there are a whole set of foundational elements that we need to invest in. One is basic research and the institutions that do basic research. One is science, technology, engineering, and math education, STEM education, where we concluded we have to lift the country's game in STEM education, both to get the high-tech entrepreneurs and the inventors and the discoverers of the future, but also to get the tech-savvy workforce that the 21st century economy requires. Another one of the foundations is the forms of infrastructure that are relevant to innovation, and that includes, of course, information technology, computing, monitoring, space technology, a whole set of infrastructural elements, broadband, wireless, and so on. And the fourth foundational element is the political and economic environment that is not only receptive to, but nurturing of entrepreneurship and innovation. And the administration proceeded then to construct specific initiatives focused on these various foundational elements, a whole set of initiatives in STEM education, a set of initiatives in information technology, in making high-speed broadband more widely available, a whole set of initiatives around making government data more accessible, more open, and in usable form, so entrepreneurs could build businesses and develop new services based on the availability of these enormous data sets that the taxpayers had paid to create. We've had major initiatives in health information technology, figuring out how to use IT to get better outcomes for more people at lower costs. We've had, of course, major initiatives in the energy space. We've had an advanced manufacturing partnership, which is looking to the private sector, the academic sector, and the government to work together to figure out how to bring back manufacturing in the United States using advanced technologies, IT, robotics, nanotechnology, other dimensions of material science, synthetic biology, the so-called bioeconomy.
Do you think, you know, beginning in the late 1980s, industrial policy became a real political struggle on Capitol Hill.
And we don't call it that anymore.
I know, and the term went away, and you know, we still fight over choosing winners and losers. There are lots of fights, but do you think that, I mean, if you look at it from Silicon Valley rather than from Washington, it's clear the government played a role, but often the role feels very serendipitous. It doesn't feel like innovation can be planned frequently, although it clearly has had a role.
Well, it can't be planned and shouldn't be. But what we understand very clearly now is that a fundamental role of government is to support basic research, which is research at a stage before you can determine what the outcome is likely to be, what the implications are likely to be, what products are likely to emerge from it. It's very well understood by economists why the private sector will never invest in basic research to the level that society's interests require. The risks are too high, the outcomes too uncertain, the potential returns too distant, the findings not always appropriable. And so we know that government investments in basic research have been enormously important over the years. You know, it was NSF grants to a couple of Stanford graduate students named Larry Page and Sergey Brin, which ultimately led to the company we all know, very close by, with, last I looked, $270 billion in market capitalization, tens of thousands of employees.
Classic serendipitous investment.
And so on. If you were to ask Charles Towns, as he was sitting on a park bench in Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C., thinking about the maser, which was the predecessor of the laser, Charlie Towns had absolutely no idea that the technologies that grew from this area of basic research would be how we cut metal, how we copy, how we determine distances, how we listen to music and watch movies. I mean, it would be insanity for Charlie Towns to have envisioned that. But it was government investments in that kind of research. Look at the genomics revolution. Government investments. Look at, you talked about natural gas and fracking. Look at seismic exploration, horizontal drilling. It was government investments, even in that area of practical application, that then led to oil company investments, that then led to the development of technologies that actually worked.
Do you worry that the DARPA of today, for example, that has funded many of those crucial innovations, is a very different beast than the DARPA of the 1960s, which was committed to just very blue sky things without a lot of restrictions on the research? Now there are milestones and benchmarks, and I know that people...
Well, this is partly, you know, a reaction to the dilemmas of funding. That is, when money is tight, everybody wants accountability. And doing high-risk, high-return research in that environment becomes more difficult. But this administration is committed to doing high-risk, high-return research, having the government fund it. And while there was a period in which DARPA had shorter-term focuses and less out-of-the-box thinking, they've really moved back into the outside-the-box thinking, into the high-risk, high-return stuff, at the instruction of the administration. I mean, President Obama is remarkably sophisticated about these matters. He understands the importance of basic research. He understands the importance of being willing to try hard things and sometimes fail. And he's willing to continue to back it, and he has backed it in the budgets that he has produced.
So out of this budgetary process, how much at risk is basic research funding in these budgets? What does it mean?
I regard that situation as a glass that is both half empty and half full. Basic research budgets are not as big as I think, or as the president thinks, would benefit the country. At the same time, we have done better at protecting basic research in a difficult environment than might have been expected. Indeed, research as a whole and basic research have done better under these really very difficult funding constraints than virtually any other sector you can look at. And it's again because the president understands it. When the president went to the National Academy of Sciences just a few months after being inaugurated the first time and spoke at the annual meeting of the National Academy, he was the first president since JFK to do that. And he devoted about 2/3 of the speech to the importance of government investments in basic research. You know, I think most people expect that the president's going to come, he's going to talk about science and technology in the economy, science and technology in energy, science and technology in health. He spent 2/3 of the time talking about the importance of basic research to all of these domains. Basic research as the generator of the insights on which all applied technology and development in the future would draw. And he's been true to that. in the budgets he's put forward. We haven't always gotten it all through the Congress. You know, one of the things that's quite striking, the Department of Defense, which is about as applied an agency as you can find, has been spending in this administration over $2 billion a year on basic research.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you about space exploration. One very pragmatic question and one more philosophical. Mining for asteroids, is it worth it as a goal from an economic point of view?
Far from clear. It is interesting that there are some private operators who are interested in that possibility. There are, however, obviously a number of reasons for being interested in technology relating to be able to not only identify asteroids on a collision course with the Earth, but be able to manipulate their trajectories. Because as we were reminded not so long ago, with an impact in the range of 500 kilotons over Siberia, asteroids do from time to time strike the Earth. Some of them are big enough to do damage on the surface, and some of them, like the one that hit 65 million years ago, are big enough to exterminate most life on Earth. And in order to prove that we are more intelligent than the dinosaurs, it would be prudent for us to figure out how to avoid such an outcome should a large asteroid on a collision course occur in our lifetimes.
So we're still pursuing the notion of sending a man and or women to Mars. Wouldn't it make more sense to invest in the kind of artificial intelligence technologies that could do that mission without humans? Because not only would we get there and do the mission, but we would probably get spin-offs that would be dramatically valuable on Earth.
Well, we get spin-offs out of virtually everything we do in space, including there have been many spin-offs from the human space exploration program we've had. It is an interesting controversy about robotic versus human exploration. As in some other areas we've talked about tonight, I myself am in favor of a portfolio. I think the robotic missions are enormously important. They're effective. The Curiosity Mars Science Lab, the rover that has been crawling around the surface of Mars, making extraordinary discoveries, is a great example of the potential of robotic missions. Yeah. I had the pleasure of being in the control room when Curiosity landed. It was a gut-wrenching experience. During the period when we knew, because of the time lag in the signals getting here, it had already either successfully landed or crashed and burned, and we didn't know which. I mean, it's fabulous stuff. Yeah. These robotic missions. Yeah. But there are also things that humans can do and ways in which the human exploration of the solar system fulfills a fundamental desire in the human race to explore that make it worth doing. Yeah. And so, again, my answer is all of the above.
I wouldn't have brought this up, but your staff did. Apparently there's new information about Area 51. And I was wondering if you could tell me what we know now about Area 51 that we didn't know before.
What a question. You know, I was mentioning backstage that I've had the good fortune to know personally every science advisor to a president of the United States since George Kistiakowsky, who was Eisenhower's second science advisor. And every one of these folks, were they all still alive, would tell you that as soon as they get into office, they receive a spate of letters, more recently a spate of emails, demanding the truth about Area 51. Yeah. Admit that there are alien bodies buried there. There are no alien bodies buried in Area 51.
It's really disappointing to learn that.
I'm so sorry, but...
Well, to pursue the alien theme, you know, every time we turn around, there are more Goldilocks planets discovered. I mean, it's just extraordinary.
It is extraordinary.
And you're probably familiar with the Drake equation.
I am.
And are you puzzled? And we're 2 miles, maybe a mile and a half from SETI's headquarters here. Are you puzzled why we haven't had why, if there's so many hospitable planets in the universe,
haven't we heard from
Yeah,
anybody?
why haven't we heard from anybody?
Well, there was actually a very interesting paper written some decades ago now on just this question. The title of the paper was, "Where is Everybody?" and a number of hypotheses were put forward for why, given the odds that intelligent life must have developed in a number of different places in the universe, just as a probabilistic matter, why haven't we heard from anybody? And one of the hypotheses was that although intelligent civilizations do develop elsewhere from time to time, they have a very short half-life after they develop nuclear weapons. That a large fraction of the civilizations that develop exterminate themselves in fairly short order. Another hypothesis is they quickly learn that it's a bad idea to advertise their presence. And so they do all their communication with fiber optic cables rather than sending radio signals around that could propagate and lead to a predatory civilization finding them and devouring them. So, I mean, obviously nobody knows the answer to this question, and nobody knows whether the probabilistic equation is really right, because we don't really understand enough about exactly how life began to be confident that it has arisen a huge number of times elsewhere in the universe. But again, based on what we do know, it does seem awfully likely that there is life elsewhere in the universe, and if there's life, there must, in some circumstances, be intelligent life.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you more about robotics. One of your initiatives was on collaborative robotics, building machines that could work effectively with humans. Last year, when I was reporting about the growth of manufacturing robotics, I took a very interesting tour at a Flextronics plant that makes solar panels in Fremont. They had a big sign on the wall that said, because Governor Brown was about to visit, bringing jobs and manufacturing back to California. And I did a careful count of the number of people who were on this very automated line, and there were 9 people.
I think I read your your article or your blog about this.
And so it's a difficult, I mean, it's a good news, bad news potential situation. I certainly would not criticize your initiative, but we may end up with an economy that actually doesn't have more jobs, even though it's more productive and more competitive internationally. And I wonder if you've looked at that challenge.
Well, first of all, this is certainly outside my domain of expertise. I'm very familiar with the challenge, and certainly aware that the composition of employment is constantly changing. That is, we have far fewer jobs in agriculture now than we did 100 years ago in this country. And that's partly due to mechanization, obviously, and other ways in which productivity in agriculture has increased. But the unemployment rate on the average is not much different than it was a long time ago, because many other kinds of jobs have materialized, and the people who once were doing agriculture are now doing other productive things. And I think the same thing is true in many of the manufacturing fields, is there will be certainly jobs for people who can work with the high technology processes that are involved in modern manufacturing, but there won't be as many of them as used to exist on assembly lines that were mainly populated by people. And there will be, at the same time, jobs in other industries. I mean, look at information technology. Where was information technology 30 years ago?
Yeah.
And where is it now in terms of the number of jobs?
No, to your Google point, I mean, who would have thought that there would be this job category called search engine optimization, which employs hundreds of thousands of people? But what's striking to me is the debate has returned with a vengeance.
Yeah, it has.
Everybody's all over the spectrum on that.
And it's not easy to sort out. But I'm reminded of that famous statement. I'm not sure, it might have been Bill Joy who made it, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah.
And I think of the little GPS devices that we have in our cell phones, or separately in our automobiles. And I ask, what would my grandparents have made of this?
Yeah.
It would be pure magic. To think, here's this little box this big, out of which a voice comes and tells you when you have to turn left and when you have to turn right, and how far ahead The next turn you have to make is, and shows you on a little map exactly where you are. You think of the technologies that go into that, it'd be indistinguishable from magic even 50 years ago.
Yeah. You know, there's an argument that it's actually changing our hippocampus because we no longer have to worry about location. And the taxi drivers had in London had demonstrably larger hippocampuses because they had to remember the map of London.
I am not familiar with that research, but if it's true, it's remarkable.
So this week in Silicon Valley, you know, the number one technology issue has been the 8 Silicon Valley companies who have sort of made this statement about surveillance and asked the administration to rein in the NSA. And I just wondered if you thought that there was a way for the administration to rebuild the trust of the IT industry, which is such a cornerstone of the American economy.
Well, obviously, the president has talked about this. He talked about it in May. He talked about it again in August. He has made clear that he's called upon the PCLOB, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, to review the whole domain. He's established an independent commission of very senior people to advise him. He has made very clear that he wants to work with the Congress to increase transparency, clarify oversight in this domain. The president understands very clearly that there is a challenge there, there's a problem, and that it has to be addressed, and he's committed to addressing it. And I think as the results of these various reviews come in, we'll be hearing more about how he plans to do it.
Yeah. It's, you know, most people, the name John Poindexter hasn't come up much in this current round of negotiations, which kind of surprises me because Poindexter, for all he was vilified for in originally developing the Total Information Awareness Program, had this notion that somehow you could square the circle between big data and individual privacy. And he actually brought a large number of computer scientists together in an effort to see if there was a way to do that. Nothing came of it, but it seems to be a pressing challenge for the technologists.
It is. There's an enormous challenge there. And it's one that we have looked at in many of its different dimensions. For example, relatively early in this administration, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, PCAST, did a major report about health IT. I mentioned in my quick catalog of some of the things that the administration has done in initiatives in science and technology is in the health information technology domain. And a very distinguished group, not just members of PCAST, but a larger working group that they assembled, grappled with this question of just in the health domain, of how do you get the benefits of more rapid and complete sharing of patient medical records between patients and physicians and between different physicians who are treating the same patient, and how do you get the benefit of knowing what has worked and what has not worked in trying to address maladies that are afflicting millions of people. Mm-hmm. How do you do all that while protecting privacy? That's already a big challenge. I mean, leaving aside the national security and anti-terrorism and national intelligence space, just in the health IT domain, it's a huge challenge. A lot of effort has gone into figuring out how to do that, and there will need to be more effort still in this whole big data domain across all of its applications if we're to successfully get it right.
I want to turn to these, but before I do, I just have to ask you about my favorite PCAST report, which was done last year, and it was on the issue of spectrum and using spectrum in a modern way with computation. And what struck me about reading the report at the time, I can't remember the specific numbers, but the notion is you could so much more efficiently use spectrum that it would basically have one of these indirect serendipitous effects and perhaps recreate in the mobile wireless world the kind of economic boom that we had with the internet. Do you remember that report?
Oh, absolutely.
Have you made any,
absolutely, I remember the report. There's been a huge amount of follow-up to that report, a huge amount of interest in it in industry and in government. The new FCC chairman, Tom Wheeler, is very interested in moving forward with this. There's been a lot of action since the time of the report.
I think we could find 1,000 megahertz free somewhere to
well,
run the
again,
experiment.
The most fundamental proposition is not just that spectrum today, while it seems to be running out, there's only a finite amount of it, and there seem to be exponentially increasing demands for it, particularly because of the enormous success of broadband wireless. So the initial position is, well, we look around and we see what parts of it really aren't being all that intensively used so that we can reallocate it more efficiently. But there's a much more scientifically interesting and more fundamental idea in spectrum sharing, in that the kinds of technologies we know how to build today can basically allow multiple users to use the same spectrum without interfering with each other. And that is the proposition that underlies the most forward-leaning recommendations in that report, and the ones that we're most interested in seeing implemented in the decade ahead. That is the insight that will turn a situation of scarcity in spectrum into a situation of abundance.
That would be very dramatic. Let me turn to the audience. How often do you advise the president one-on-one?
It varies. Some weeks I don't see him at all. Some weeks I see him 2 or 3 times. I think the record, the largest number of times I ever saw him in a week was 5 or 6. But that's not the average week. It depends on what else he's doing and where the science and technology issues are on the agenda.
Is the White House looking into any long-range programs like the National Highway Program or the Apollo program?
Well, that sort of brings up the question of grand challenges. I mean, the Apollo program was a great example of a grand challenge. President Kennedy says we're going to go to the moon, put humans on the moon by the end of the decade. We have a number of grand challenges underway now. One is the sunshot. Let's make solar energy as cheap as coal. Another is EV everywhere. Let's make it attractive and technologically and economically practical to have electric cars everywhere that provide the same performance and convenience of transportation that gasoline-fueled cars do today. Another grand challenge is the BRAIN initiative, which the president announced last year, in which, for a multitude of purposes, we're bringing together multidisciplinary teams and a diversity of approaches to better understand how the brain works, to better map the brain, to understand the functioning of large groups of neurons acting together rather than simply looking at neurons one at a time. We'll never understand what the brain does until we can do that. This is an enormous challenge. You know, the Human Genome Project was a grand challenge, which, by the way, it's been estimated has returned $140 in economic activity for every dollar the government invested, sort of getting back to this question of the relation between basic science and ultimate outcomes for the society. So we are actually very enamored in this administration of the power of grand challenges to inspire, to energize, to get people working together in pursuit of a big, inspirational common goal.
One of those goals was to reach 1 million electric cars by 2015. Is there any chance?
I don't think we're going to make that one.
You can see, you can feel in the market here in California that we're picking up, but
yes, absolutely.
It still seems like it's a long way to go.
I've never imagined seeing as many Teslas as one sees driving around Palo Alto.
That's an anomaly. But you can get a really great deal on an electric car these days. It's really quite amazing that the prices seem to be falling. How do we value STEM education? How does it correlate to compensation for teachers and educators?
That's actually a great question, and the answer, first of all, is we don't value it nearly highly enough. We don't value education in general highly enough, particularly at the K through 12 level. There was just another report that came out in the last week or so trying to look in detail at why countries that do better than the United States, Singapore, Finland, South Korea, what are they doing differently to get such superior outcomes in standardized tests in science and math? And one of the answers that emerged from this comparative study is that virtually all of the countries that do better than we pay teachers much better than we do.
Oh, shock.
They make, teaching is a very high prestige position, and it's suitably compensated in terms of the salaries of teachers and principals. I mean, this is a very fundamental insight. And of course, there is a challenge associated with this, that in most of these countries that have done this, education is controlled by the national government. So they can make a decision as a country as to how they're going to do this. In the United States, of course, education, K through 12 education, is largely in the province of the states and communities. And so it's a harder thing to wave a wand and say everybody is going to pay teachers better. But it's clear that that is an important part of the answer. But we also have to persuade more of our best and brightest by means other than just salary, that teaching is an exciting and rewarding profession, and particularly in the science and math fields, we have to get more people who are studying science and math in college to decide that the way they want to apply that is in teaching. And one of the initiatives the administration has launched in this domain is encouraging colleges and universities around the country to create programs in which students majoring in math and science can get a teaching credential at the same time.
Is it underway?
It is.
Yeah. Okay, good. Put the National Science Foundation budget into perspective relative to other nationally funded programs. Then rationalize it. It's tiny.
Well, let me say a couple of things about that. The National Science Foundation budget is about $7.5 billion a year. The NIH budget is about $30 billion a year. And the DOE Office of Science is about $5 billion a year. Science at NASA is about $9.5 billion a year. If you look at the whole federal science budget, applied and basic research, but not development, it's about $64 billion a year. Now, is that enough when the military budget is, in round numbers, $500 or $600 billion a year? Should we be spending more on science? A lot of us think so. But anybody who reads the newspaper or watches the television knows that we have a very challenging budget situation in the government. Reaching agreement between the parties on what the budget should be and what the priorities within it should be has been an enormous challenge.
When I looked at international research and development spending comparatively, we spend far more than any other country.
We are by far the biggest.
I was actually kind of struck. But and
well,
then
public and private, we spend over $400 billion a year on R&D.
Yeah.
And one of the things that most people don't recognize, unless they're geeks who study these statistics, is that industry funds about 2/3 of all the research and development done in this country. Of course, they are heavier on development, and the government is heavier on the basic research, and applied is more evenly split. But we do spend more than any other country. China is catching up.
They're number 2.
China is number 2, and China has been increasing its R&D expenditures by something like 20% per year, which a little arithmetic reveals will lead to them catching up and surpassing us unless the pattern changes in not very long.
Should we worry about something like the fact that they have the world's fastest supercomputer now? Is that a fact of national concern?
Well, I would say a couple of things about that. Certainly the Chinese are going to be increasingly formidable competitors in the IT space. But people who think about supercomputers know that the particular metric on which China currently holds the record is not a particularly informative metric about the real capacity of high-performance computers.
Yeah.
And the capacity to handle big data is, in fact, probably more important today than pure floating point operations per second.
I know a group of people who are trying to run...
And we're ahead in that.
Yes, yeah. I know a group of people who are trying to find a way to run that benchmark on a cluster of iPhones. And so maybe we can, if you get enough iPhones, maybe we can reclaim the...
Well, you know, it was mentioned then in that little film at the beginning, interestingly enough, about how your phone is 1,000 times more powerful than an IBM 7094. I was the operator of an IBM 7094 at Lockheed in the early 1960s. That was my summer job for one summer. And I've kept track ever since of the power of the computers I was using compared to that 7094. And the last I looked, my laptop was equal to 5,000 of them.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it would take it's interesting because the IBM 7094 was a big enough computer to handle our thermonuclear weapon design challenges at the time, a big enough computer to do the orbital mechanics for the moon mission, and so on. And it would probably take 6 months to boot Windows 8.
Yeah. Well, this has substantially more power than the Cray 2 I visited at Livermore.
Yeah.
I mean, it's substantially more power.
It is stunning.
In 1986, I think it was.
The difference is really stunning.
Yeah.
The fact that we've all got supercomputers in our pockets.
Yeah. A couple more questions. Is there any possibility that autonomous drones could someday transport people? And then can they be zero-emission vehicles?
The autonomous drone business reminds me of an old joke about the voice coming over the intercom of your airline. This is your captain speaking. This is your captain speaking. This is your captain speaking. The crew is bailed out. A scientist or technologist should almost never say never. If it doesn't violate the second law of thermodynamics, it probably can't be ruled out altogether.
There's a company within walking distance here working on the problem. Here's an interesting one.
Zero-emission vehicles you asked about too, and I didn't answer that. You know, years ago when that concept first surfaced, a colleague of mine said, there are no zero-emission vehicles, there are only elsewhere-emission vehicles. Having to do with the fact that the electricity has to come from somewhere, and currently it comes, at that time it was coming 50% from coal-burning plants, now it's below 40%.
Yeah.
But it's still a lot of fossil fuels are burned to generate electricity, and until you have a cleaner electricity generating system, electric vehicles are not zero-emission vehicles.
Well, to that point, here's a question. Nuclear energy is the future. What about thorium? It's a type of nuclear reactor. Let's see. Ran a thorium nuclear reactor. Somebody in Pennsylvania ran a thorium nuclear reactor for 30 years. I guess, is that generation 3 or generation?
No, thorium is just a different fuel cycle. When you say thorium reactor, there can be thorium fast reactors, thorium thermal reactors. My own view is that thorium attains a level of high interest about every 15 or 20 years, and then people look into it carefully and discover that there are, like practically everything else, some liabilities. Thorium is about 3 times as abundant in the Earth's crust as uranium is, but there is already so much uranium that, contrary to a widespread misimpression, running out of uranium is not a threat that could possibly be meaningful any time in the next 50 to 100 years. And even then, if we were to master the technology of extracting uranium from seawater, on which much progress has in fact been made, then you couldn't run out of uranium for tens of thousands of years. So the fact that thorium is 3 times as abundant in the Earth's crust is no big deal.
Yeah.
The question is, what are the economic characteristics, the safety characteristics, the waste-generating characteristics, the proliferation characteristics of the different fuel cycles? And every time thorium gets a really careful look, which again happens about every 15 years, starting in 1950, the conclusion is reached that in the ways people have conceived using thorium up until now, the liabilities are at least as big as the assets.
Okay. So a follow-on. As a former fusion researcher, what do you see as the future of this potential technology? Can it get beyond huge, expensive machines that seem to disappoint rather than move forward?
It's a rather provocative formulation. Fusion still faces challenges. You know, we've been working on fusion for some 60 years now as a practical energy source, and there are still no fusion devices that yield more energy than they consume. And consuming more energy than they yield is a rather unattractive characteristic in a power source. I believe that it continues to be worth pursuing the fusion possibility, although it remains to be seen whether it can be made practical. Because even once you pass the energy break-even threshold and have a fusion machine that yields more energy than it takes to get it going and keep it going, you still have a long way to go in terms of engineering characteristics in order to have a device that will yield an energy profit without 1,000 PhDs standing around in full-time attendance nursing it along. And that, too, would not be an attractive device for an electric utility. So I don't believe that it is likely that we will find any kilowatt hours from fusion in the electricity grid before 2040 or 2050 at the soonest. It's not a near-term option, but it nonetheless has long-term attractions. If you ask, what can we do between now and 2050 to meet the sort of goal that the president talked about of 80% reductions, that's going to be very challenging. And then you ask, what are we going to do for an encore after 2050? It sure would be nice if you had fusion in the mix for that encore, and so I believe it's worth continuing investment to try to get there.
Okay. Let me make this the final question. It's quirky. I'm not quite sure how to interpret it, but if we switched from income tax to a carbon tax, the whole country would be motivated to fix the issue. Comments?
You know, in Washington, the T word is anathema.
Of any kind.
And I will only point out, therefore, that every economist who has studied the issue concludes that it is more efficient to tax bads than to tax goods. And if you believe that income and capital gains are good and carbon emissions are bad, and if you believe the result that every economist reaches, then we would be better off as a society if we taxed income and capital gains less and taxed carbon more. But that is not to comment on the political feasibility of doing that anytime soon.
Well, thank you for coming this evening. I really appreciate it.